I never thought I would share this story with anyone. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's a truth I have carried for years. Sometimes, the most unexpected people enter our lives and make us question everything we thought we knew about ourselves. From the outside, my life seemed perfect. I had the kind of existence many women dream of: a beautiful house in the most prestigious neighborhood, a husband admired and respected in his field, and financial security that ensured I never had to worry about bills or budgets. I had it all. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. The truth was much more complicated. James and I met in college. He was brilliant and ambitious, with an unstoppable drive that made people take notice. I fell in love with his passion, the intensity with which he pursued his dreams, and the way he saw the world as a place of endless possibilities. When he proposed, I didn't hesitate. I believed in us, in the extraordinary life we would build together. And for the first few years, we did just that, young, in love, exploring the world side by side as James climbed the corporate ladder. But success came at a cost. The higher he rose, the more demanding his work became. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the man I had married began to fade, replaced by someone consumed by achievements, status, and the relentless chase of the next big deal. I told myself it was temporary, that once he reached a certain level, things would settle. But they never did. Instead, the distance between us grew. We lived in the same house but occupied different worlds. Conversations became mere exchanges of logistics and social obligations. The connection that had once felt unshakable dimmed until I could barely remember what it was like to be truly seen by him. Then came Michael. James hired him as our family driver, insisting that I deserved the comfort and convenience. "You shouldn't have to worry about traffic or parking," he said one evening, squeezing my shoulder in what passed for affection these days. I didn't argue. It was easier to accept these gestures and to acknowledge the loneliness creeping into every corner of my life. Michael was in his early 30s, a few years younger than me. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, professional yet never cold. At first, I barely noticed him. He was just another fixture in my carefully curated world, someone who ferried me to appointments, shopping trips, and lunches with women whose lives were as meticulously constructed as mine. I sat in the back seat, scrolling through my phone or lost in thought, while he navigated the city with silent efficiency. I don't remember exactly when things began to shift. Perhaps it was the day I received the news about my father's declining health. I climbed into the car, struggling to hold back tears, unwilling to fall apart in front of someone who was, at best, a stranger. But Michael noticed, not in an intrusive way, but with a subtle kindness. "Would you like to take the scenic route today, Mrs. Harrington?" His voice was calm, his eyes meeting mine briefly in the rearview mirror. Sometimes it helps to see the water when things feel heavy. His words caught me off guard. When was the last time someone had noticed my emotions, let alone acknowledged them? "Yes," I said quietly. "That would be nice." We drove along the coastline in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The vast, endless stretch of the ocean calmed something inside me. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. "Thank you," I murmured as he opened the door. A small smile touched his lips. "Anytime, Mrs. Harrington." After that day, something changed. I began to look forward to the moments in the car, a brief respite from the emptiness of my home, from the life that felt increasingly like a performance. I started sitting in the front seat, claiming it was easier for conversation, though the truth was I craved something real. Michael surprised me. He was well-read, thoughtful, and insightful. He wasn't just a driver. He was a man with dreams, working tirelessly to save money for graduate school. He had opinions on books, politics, and life, perspective that challenged me, intrigued me, made me feel alive in ways I had forgotten. Most importantly, he listened. Not the way people listen while waiting for their turn to speak, but with genuine attention, absorbing my words and responding in a way that made me feel understood. I found myself sharing more than I intended. Small frustrations at first, then pieces of my past, and eventually the quiet ache of loneliness that had become my shadow. One afternoon, as we sat in the car waiting for the rain to subside, I turned to him. "Do you ever feel like you're just playing a role? Like the person everyone thinks you are isn't really you at all?" He was silent for a moment, thoughtful. I think most people feel that way sometimes, he said finally. The difference is whether we have people in our lives who see the real us beneath the roles we play. His words lingered long after he had dropped me off. Who saw the real me anymore? Did I even recognize myself? James was busier than ever, consumed by a major acquisition that kept him at the office until ungodly hours. Some nights, he didn't come home at all. I told myself I understood. This was his dream, his ambition. But the house had never felt emptier. One evening, I attended a charity gala alone, again. James had promised to meet me there, but sent a terse apology an hour into the event. I smiled through the night, making polite conversation, crafting excuses for my absent husband. By the time I climbed into the car, the weight of it all crashed over me. "Rough night?" Michael asked gently. I tried to maintain the composure I had mastered over years of disappointment, but something inside me cracked. Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. I turned toward the window, mortified. Without a word, Michael pulled the car into a quiet overlook above the city. He said nothing, didn't even look at me, just handed me a clean handkerchief and gave me the gift of silence while I gathered myself. "I'm sorry," I whispered eventually, embarrassed. "It's been a long day." "No need to apologize," he replied softly. "We all have moments when things get too heavy to carry alone." Something in his voice, gentle, understanding, broke through the walls I had so carefully built. And for the first time in years, I spoke honestly. I told him about my marriage, my loneliness, the woman I had once been and the one I had lost along the way. He didn't offer hollow reassurances or quick fixes. Instead, he shared his own story, a life that had taken unexpected turns, dreams deferred but not forgotten. There was no bitterness in his words, just quiet resilience. "The hardest part isn't the disappointment itself," he said. "It's pretending everything is fine when it isn't." I looked at him then, really looked at him. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in a very long time. I felt seen. I had received the kind of news that shakes the ground beneath you, the kind that makes time slow and the world blur at the edges. My father's condition had worsened, and there was a chance he wouldn't recover. The weight of those words settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving. James was in Singapore for business when I called him, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound composed. I needed him. I needed the comfort of the man I had once believed would always be my safe place. "I'll try to wrap things up and come back early," he said, his tone sympathetic but distracted. We both knew it was an empty promise. Michael was the one who drove me to the hospital. He didn't ask questions or fill the silence with unnecessary words. He simply took me where I needed to go, his presence steady in the background as I navigated the labyrinth of emotions that came with watching a parent slip away. He waited while I sat beside my father, holding his frail hand, whispering words I wasn't sure he could still hear. He waited while I met with doctors, their voices measured, their words clinical, offering statistics instead of hope. He waited while I tried to absorb the reality of it all. When I finally emerged, exhausted and emotionally drained, Michael was still there, leaning against the car, hands tucked into his pockets, rain misting the air around him. "You didn't have to wait," I murmured, touched by his consideration. "I didn't want you to be alone," he replied simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A gentle spring rain had begun to fall as we drove home, the kind that made the city lights shimmer, softening the world in a way that felt almost merciful. We didn't speak much, but the silence between us was different from the emptiness I had grown so accustomed to. It was a silence that held space rather than distance, one that offered comfort without expectation. When we pulled into the driveway, he stepped out first, opening an umbrella and waiting for me to join him. He walked me to the door, the rain tapping softly against the fabric above us. I turned to thank him, and for the briefest moment, our eyes met. There was something in his expression that caught me off guard, concern, care, and something else I couldn't quite name. "If you need anything, even just someone to talk to," he said, his voice steady but quiet, "I'm here, not as your driver, as your friend." I don't know what came over me in that moment. Maybe it was the weight of grief pressing down on me. Maybe it was a loneliness that had wrapped itself around my life so tightly I had stopped noticing it. Maybe it was simply the human need to reach for warmth when everything else felt cold. I reached out and took his hand. Just for a moment. "Thank you," I whispered. His fingers tightened around mine, briefly, gently, a silent acknowledgement of something unspoken, something fragile yet undeniable. Then, as quickly as it had happened, he stepped back, maintaining the boundary between us with a respect that made my heart ache. That night, alone in a house that had never truly felt like home, I faced a truth I had been avoiding. I was developing feelings for Michael, feelings that stretched beyond friendship, beyond what was appropriate, feelings that terrified me. I spent the next week trying to rationalize it, telling myself it was only the vulnerability of my father's illness, that I was simply projecting my emotions onto the one person who had shown me kindness. I told myself it would pass. But when I was with him, those rationalizations felt hollow. There was something real between us, something that had nothing to do with my marriage or his job. It was about who we were, the way we saw each other, the way we understood without having to explain. I knew I was standing at a crossroads. I could acknowledge what was happening and put an end to it before it went any further, request a different driver, create distance, protect the marriage that had become more of a shell than a partnership. Or I could let myself follow this feeling, see where it led, knowing it could destroy everything. The decision was made for me when James called one evening, his voice more engaged than it had been in years. "I've been thinking," he said, serious in a way that made me sit down, "about us, about how much we've drifted apart." I hadn't expected it, hadn't thought he even noticed how far we had fallen. "You have?" I asked carefully. "I miss you, Liz," he said, using the nickname he hadn't spoken in years. "I know I've been absent. I know work has consumed me, but I want to fix this. If you're willing to try." His words hit me like a physical force. After all this time, after all the nights spent feeling invisible, he was finally seeing what had been lost. It should have been everything I wanted to hear. But all I could think about was Michael, his kind eyes, his quiet strength, the way he made me feel seen. And in that moment, I realized just how far I had already gone. "I want that too," I heard myself say. And it wasn't entirely a lie. Part of me did want to save my marriage, to fight for what James and I had once had. But another part of me was already mourning a future that could never be. The next day, when Michael arrived to take me to a lunch appointment, I knew what I had to do. "James and I are going to work on our marriage," I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. His stepping back from work. "We're going to try again." His expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, something that looked a lot like pain before it was masked by understanding. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "Everyone deserves a chance at happiness." I wanted to tell him that he made me happy, that in another life, in another world, things might have been different. But those words would have been selfish, a cruelty neither of us deserved. "I think it would be best if I requested another driver," I said, forcing the words out, each one heavier than the last. "For a while, at least." He nodded, professional as always. "I understand." We rode in silence. But this time, the silence carried a weight we could both feel. When we arrived, he turned to me one last time. "You deserve to be happy, Elizabeth," he said softly, "whether it's with James or someone else. Don't settle for less than being truly seen." I watched him drive away, an ache settling in my chest, something that felt both like an ending and a beginning. James came home the next day, true to his word. He made changes. He carved out time for us, scheduled counseling sessions, put in the effort to rebuild what had been lost. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments when I wondered if we were just going through the motions. But there were also moments of real connection, glimpses of the man I had once fallen in love with. I never saw Michael again. He transferred to another position within the company, and eventually I heard he had left to pursue his graduate studies. I was happy for him. But even now, on quiet, rainy days, I find myself thinking about that moment when he held my hand, about the roads not taken, the what-ifs that every life holds. I don't regret my choice. Staying and fighting for my marriage was the right thing to do, but I will always be grateful to the man who was supposed to be just my driver, who, instead, became the person who reminded me that I deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be known. In saving my marriage, I lost a connection that had awakened something in me. But that awakening, I